Israel is one of the most prominent and controversial nations in history, with a history that dates back to ancient religious prophecies up to the rise of the Zionist movement. The building of modern Israel involved men and women who set out to make this endeavor a reality. Even before Tel Aviv was nothing more than a town of 15,000 Jews under the British Mandate, surrounded as well by hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. One of these women was Golda Meir, who would change her last name to the Hebrew Golda Meir as she established herself as the matriarch of Israel. Of humble origin, Golda was a politician, diplomat, and prime minister of her country. With the appearance of a sweet but firm mother, her tenacious and uncompromising character earned her the other nickname of Iron Lady, as well as great praise and serious criticism for her actions. Today we'll reflect and review not just Golda Meir's life, but also the history of Israel. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking to you. This is the New Encyclopedia. Please support us by liking the video and leaving comments, which we always read, by turning on notifications with the bell, subscribing to the channel, of course, and sharing this material with all your contacts on WhatsApp, on social media, and anywhere else. So without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. Born with the name Golda Meir, Golda Meir was born on May 3, 1898, in a Jewish family settled in Kyiv, a city that at that time was part of the Russian Empire. Like Christians or Muslims, the Jewish community was spread throughout the world, with a significant presence in Russia, Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. However, unlike various monarchies or republics that emerged based on a primary religion that shaped them, whether they were Christian or Muslim republics or monarchies or of Buddhist composition or other denominations, at the time Golda Meir was born, and for almost 2,000 years before that, there was no state or nation formed on the basis of a Jewish population and religion. Now, when Golda Meir was born, important steps were already being taken in the creation of such a state, internationally recognized. But we will come back to this later. Little Golda was the seventh of the 8 children of her parents, Moshe and Blum Meir, who worked as a carpenter and a housewife, respectively. However, Golda's childhood was quite precarious, marked by severe poverty that affected her and her siblings, or at least those who had managed to survive. Quite bitter memories. During the late Russian Empire at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th century, conflicts between Tsarism and the Orthodox Church against members of Judaism, Catholicism, Islam, and other religions became more common, as supporters of Tsarism accused them of collaborating with subversive movements against the Russian Empire. This led to a series of laws and actions that restricted the freedoms of the Jewish community and other religious or political groups considered harmful to the cohesion of Russia. Besides this conflict, his family was poor. Golda Meir's father left for the United States in 1903 to seek a better life for his wife and children, who for the time being stayed in the city of Kiev. However, Golda's mother couldn't stand the situation and left for her family's house. In Belarus, however, the situation doesn't improve, and poverty continues to eat away at the Meir family. However, the situation changes when, in 1906, already settled in Milwaukee, United States, Golda's father calls his family to come live with him. Luck was beginning to change for the Meir family, whose economic situation started to improve and eventually even reached a considerable level of status in the United States. Golda Meir lived in Denver for a time, where she discovered her passion for political activism and the Zionist movement. This was because in Denver she met several Jewish families in whose homes and study centers topics such as Zionism, feminism, mostly socialist political ideas, history, literature, and much more were discussed. At that time, the United States was home to a large Jewish community. It was the perfect setting for a young Golda to formally begin her political and Zionist activism with her affiliation to the so-called Poale Zion in 1915. This was a socialist political party with branches worldwide. It advocated, among other things, for the dignity of Jewish workers scattered around the world and the creation of a home for all Jews. Golda finished high school in 1915 and graduated as a teacher from the Milwaukee Normal School in 1917, beginning to work both as a teacher and as a political activist and militant. An example of her rapid rise in the ranks of Zionism in the United States was her election as Milwaukee's representative to the newly created American Jewish Congress, an association that was created by American Jews in order to defend their interests and rights as a group in that nation and around the world. In that same year, 1917, at the age of 19, Golda married a man named Morris Meyerson. But the condition she set for consummating the marriage was that they had to practice Aliyah. Aliyah is the term that describes the action taken by Jews when they decide to migrate to what they call the Promised Land, or the Land of Israel. However, it wasn't until after the First World War that Golda and her husband decided to make this journey. After this war, this land passed from the hands of the Ottoman Empire to the hands of the British Empire, when the so-called British Mandate of Palestine was established. During this period, when this land was under British rule, a new and substantial migration of Jews to this land began. So Golda and her husband in 1921 embarked on this journey. However, by then, this land, called Palestine by some and Israel by others, was far from being the Israel we know today as the home of the Jews. Before we discuss Golda's arrival in the land of Israel, at that time under an administration called the British Mandate of Palestine, it is necessary to make a very brief and superficial but fundamental review of the history of the Jews and the so-called land of Israel. According to their beliefs and what is written in the scriptures, the Jewish people make their entrance into history when the God Yahweh makes a covenant with the patriarch Abraham, promising him that he will be the father of a great nation, and that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan, located to the southwest of the so-called Fertile Crescent, with Canaan being what is now known as the Levant region, now better known as Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. It is in this region and beyond, throughout the Near East, where the so-called Semitic peoples developed, such as the Canaanites, the Arameans, the Akkadians, the Hebrews, the Arabs, the Phoenicians, and others. When this alliance between the God Yahweh and Abraham is established, Abraham is proclaimed as the first Hebrew. The Hebrew people under this interpretation become the people chosen by God and would go on to develop their own religion, with their own language, customs, and distinctive rituals. After this covenant, Abraham begins a pilgrimage with the Hebrew people from the Mesopotamian lands, where they were to conquer and settle in the lands of Canaan. Abraham's son, named Yitzhak, will continue the patriarchal line, which will also be carried on by his son Yaakov. Yaakov, for his part, will have 12 sons, from whom the 12 tribes of Israel would come. At the same time, Yaakov is renamed by God himself, Yahweh, with the name Israel, marking the beginning of the use of this word and the start of when the Jewish people also begin to be called Israelites. Over time, the descendants of Yaakov, who is also renamed Israel, are enslaved by Egypt during their captivity. The Abrahamic God sends a Hebrew named Moshe to lead the Exodus back to the Promised Land. In Canaan, after parting the seas and escaping, and a long journey through the desert for 40 years, some tribes of Israel managed to reach Canaan and succeed in reconquering the territory. Around the year 1400 before Christ, the Israelites integrated with the already existing sedentary populations, assimilating their forms of government and gradually abandoning their nomadic and wandering ways. Over 3 centuries later, in the 11th century before Christ, faced with threats from the Philistines, the Israelite tribes decided to unite under a single kingdom called the Kingdom of Israel. During this union, the famous kings Shaul, then David, and finally Shlomo ruled. However, after the death of the latter, due to social and religious problems, the kingdom was divided in two, the Kingdom of Israel on one side and the Kingdom of Yehuda on the other, around the year 930 before Christ. But both kingdoms, after 400 years, would be invaded by the Assyrians and Babylonians, as well as by numerous groups, until the Romans arrived and established themselves in that territory. In year 6 after Christ, in the province of Judea, an event occurs as Judea becomes a Roman province, dividing Jewish and world history. Although most of the Hebrews in that land of Judea did not recognize the prophet Jesus of Nazareth as the long-awaited Messiah who came to free the people of Israel, from the actions and preaching of Jesus of Nazareth and the Jewish tribes arose the apostles and preachers who would give life to Christianity and its long journey. In the early years after the time of Jesus of Nazareth, between 66 and 136 after Christ, in the province of Judea, Jewish groups rebelled in arms, unsuccessfully, 3 times against the Roman Empire, and many of the leaders of the Jewish tribes are expelled from the province of Judea, beginning a long and gradual pilgrimage of these Jewish groups and families throughout the rest of the world. After one of these rebellions, the Roman Empire changed the name of this region from the province of Judea to the province of Syria-Palestina. Palestina was another name that for a long time different non-Jewish groups from that region used to call this land, like the case of the Philistines. The truth is that in the 3 centuries after these Jewish revolts, the Roman Empire not only converted to Christianity, but shortly after, it collapses as a political unit. So the province of Syria-Palestine, or the land of Israel as called by the Jews, ends up under the rule of the Christian Byzantine Empire. But shortly after, this land is conquered by the Arabs during the Muslim expansion of the 7th century. Eventually, centuries later, it would be conquered by the Crusaders, who established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusader states in 1099 AD. But after many conflicts in the following centuries, this land eventually came under the rule and authority of the Ottoman Empire in the year 1517. It would remain part of this empire at the time our protagonist, Golda Meir, was born. Throughout all these centuries, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, not all Jews in this land were expelled or persecuted, but their presence was significantly reduced and they migrated to other parts of the world. By the year 1880, the region of what is now Israel had 470,000 inhabitants, of whom between 20,000 and 25,000 were Jews. Over 90% were Palestinian Arabs, mainly Muslim. In this sense, both the term Israel and the term Palestine were terms that coexisted for millennia, depending on which group referred to this region, and they were used at the discretion of cartographers, historians, and politicians to describe the area. To understand Golda Meir's life, it's also important to know about the political movement that arose from this situation in the Jewish community. Since the disintegration of the Kingdom of Israel before Christ and the continuous expulsions of the Hebrews from this land, a longing for the lost land and the lack of their own nation with their own territory developed within the Jewish community and the Jewish diaspora. Towards the end of the 19th century, a movement known as political Zionism began to take shape, led by Theodor Herzl, a Hungarian Jew and political activist whose main ideas revolved around designating the region of Palestine as the preferred homeland for the Jewish diaspora. In the words of Herzl, Palestine was, quote, "our always memorable historical home," unquote. Strongly influenced by the nationalisms of that era, socialist Zionism held that Jews were primarily a national group, like the Poles or the Germans, and not a religious group like Muslims or Catholics, and that, as such, they had the right to create their own state in their historic territory. In this sense, in the Jewish community, there were prominent and wealthy merchants, businessmen, and bankers who stood out, in addition with several important people from governments such as the United States and England. They began to organize themselves with the long-term goal of founding their own state. The first fundamental step towards achieving this goal took place in August 1897 when Theodor Herzl organized the so-called First Zionist Congress in the Swiss city of Basel, with the attendance of 209 delegates from 17 countries. At this Congress, the Zionists unanimously decide that the formation A Jewish state should begin as soon as possible, and therefore they had to organize the first aliyahs, that is, the first mass migrations of Jews to Palestine, which was then governed by the Ottomans, despite the initial rejection by many Jews of the time, who believed that Herzl's Zionism went against what was stipulated in the sacred scriptures of the Torah and the Talmud. The idea gained popularity within the community, and the migrations of Jews to Palestine kept increasing in size and number. Between 1881 and 1917, about 75,000 Jews migrated to that region, which was also undergoing significant changes on its own based on what was happening in the world and in the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the British government and the Crown formally issued the so-called Balfour Declaration on November 2, 1917, where it acknowledges that Jewish Zionism. In 1921, it acknowledges that Herzl's Zionism, a great Jewish power, in 1917. Kronkow acknowledges that the doublet brings us back to our protagonist, Golda Meir. Well, that same year as the Balfour Declaration, in 1917, the Ottoman Empire lost World War I and all its possessions and territory came under the control of the British Empire. This region was now officially called the British Mandate of Palestine, and it included the regions of Cisjordan and Transjordan. In this sense, under the British Mandate, Jews would have new security and a new incentive to migrate in greater numbers to Palestinian territory. This began to create the first major tensions between the Arab Palestinians and the newly arrived Jews. This is the complex situation that Golda and her husband would see upon their arrival in the land of Israel. After their arrival, Golda and her husband, as we mentioned, settled in Tel Aviv, which was under British mandate. At that time, Tel Aviv had around 15,000 residents, nearly all Jewish. However, Golda quickly moved with her husband to the Jewish agricultural colony of Merjavia in the north of Palestine. Golda lives openly working in agriculture, gets along quite well with the field workers, and continues developing her leadership qualities. For example, she was elected as her agricultural colony's representative. In the Histadrut in Hebrew was the General Federation of Workers of the Land of Israel, that is, the labor union that the Jews had established after their arrival in Palestine, and which held great influence at that time. For her outstanding leadership in the Federation of Workers, in 1928, Golda is appointed director of the women's branch of the Histadrut. Moving again to Tel Aviv and beginning to live a hectic life within the framework of her new job, from which she fights for the rights of working women. They are represented at international events such as the World Conference of Zionist Women and the 16th World Zionist Congress. From these forums, Golda contributes to popularizing the Zionist movement, while also gaining important contacts and certain diplomatic skills, which in 1932 will earn her name to go to the United States in order to collect money for the Zionist cause, raising about $250,000. Upon her return to the land of Israel, in 1934, Golda joins the leadership of the political section of the Executive Committee of the Workers' Federation. She became a key figure in the emerging politics of the Jewish community in Palestine. In this land, little by little, they were forming a prototype of a state and their own government, de facto for the Jews. Golda, in 1934, joined the ranks of the influential left-wing Mapai Party. This is how these years of Golda's life will go by, in national and international meetings and conferences. At the same time, more and more Jews are arriving in Palestine, and the clashes between Jews and Palestinians are becoming increasingly violent. This is evident in the bloody Arab revolt of 1932, Avenida Hisiana de Danonik. in National Socialist Germany, but also in other neighboring nations. Eventually, political tensions on the European continent lead to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. With all the massacres, persecutions, and tribulations that all of Europe suffered, and that the Jewish community suffered, especially in the countries under National Socialist rule. During the war, Golda was a strong advocate for the Jewish cause and supported the immigration of displaced Jews to Palestine to continue ensuring control of the area. However, the presence of this growing number of Jews arriving in the region increased the quarrels and skirmishes between the Jews and the Arab Palestinians, peoples about whom Golda always expressed criticism and rejection. Just like the situation of conflict between the Palestinians and Jews in this land, little by little it was slipping out of the hands of the British Empire, which was becoming unable to control the mandate of Palestine, as well as the cries for independence from both sides, which are becoming more and more noticeable. After World War II, Golda began to gain even more power, especially by 1946. For example, after Black Saturday, a series of raids and arrests of Zionist leaders carried out by the British authorities, who were trying to calm the tensions of the conflict situation. In the midst of this power vacuum, Golda ends up taking over the State Department in charge of international relations of the Abrokamias Jewish Agency. This Jewish agency would be closer to a governmental entity for the Jews during the British Mandate of Palestine. By that year, 1946, in the land of Palestine or Israel, the Jews had already become more than 33% of the population. But each group, Jews and Muslim Palestinians, lived separately from each other. Each group had built its own parallel state and its own de facto institutions, leading to increasingly violent clashes between the two groups. From this position as Chancellor or Secretary of State of the Jewish Agency, Golda Meir will participate in representing Jewish interests in the drafting of the resolution 181 of the United Nations, also known as the Partition Plan for Palestine. Faced with the reality that the United Kingdom was losing control of the British Mandate of Palestine and the growing violence between Palestinians and Hebrews, the United Kingdom asked that this issue be settled by a United Nations resolution. The resolution, which was eventually approved months later, recommended the creation of an Arab state and a Jewish state with a common currency and joint political authorities, trying to give each group the same amount of territory. And Jerusalem, in turn, should be maintained as an international city. But both the Arab League and the main Jewish political and armed groups do not accept this resolution. It breaks out immediately. In that same year, 1947, a civil war broke out within the Palestine Mandate, also called the Palestinian Zionist War, in which both groups would fight for control of the territory. While the British were leaving the region during the Civil War, Golda was sent to the United States by the Jewish Agency, which was then led by David Ben-Gurion. This time, Golda is firmly determined to seek money to finance the war and weapons for the Jewish state, which was at war and on the verge of being consolidated. Golda, already a well-known politician and activist, and with good old contacts in the North, she receives from important businessmen, bankers, and politicians, Jewish and non-Jewish, from the United States, the significant sum of $50 million, which she delivers upon her return in May of that year to the treasury of the Jewish Agency. That same May of 1948, 6 months after the Civil War, the Zionist groups deliver a final blow to the Palestinian Arab groups in the Civil War. The result of the war the following year, 1948, is that the Jews managed to militarily conquer 78% of the newly dissolved British Mandate of Palestine, more than 25% of what was originally stipulated in the United Nations resolution. Over 600,000 Palestinians were displaced during this chaotic war. Homes by May 14, 1948. This fundamental milestone in recent history occurred when it was officially signed. The Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel from the British Empire, a document bearing the signature of Golda Meir. The current State of Israel was officially born, whose provisional government was quickly recognized by the United States, by Iran, and by other Spanish-speaking Latin American and European countries. 3 days later, the Soviet Union did the same. They were the first to recognize the State of Israel de jure, and not just de facto, that is, as legitimate and legal. This resolution formalized the creation of the State of Israel. Immediately in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War began, also called by the Israelis the War of Independence or Liberation. In this war, various Arab states in the region, such as Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Lebanon, which opposed the creation of Israel and the displacement of the Palestinians, sent troops that entered into a new war with the Jews in that region, resulting in thousands of deaths on both sides. The Jews defeated the Arabs, and an armistice was formed with new territorial boundaries, thus consolidating the State of Israel's control over its new borders. The new state's foundation was already laid amid controversies and disputes. And would Golda Meir, at 50 years old, be a key figure in the building of this state? As a political leader and as a diplomat, who also secured crucial funding during the war, a new nation of just 914,000 people surrounded by hostile groups, with everything yet to be done. After the formal consolidation of present-day Israel, Golda briefly served as Israel's ambassador to the Soviet Union, without being able to achieve the friendly rapprochement that the government was seeking. Later, with her already long political career, she was called by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, a member of the Mapai Party, of which she was also a member, to take over the Ministry of Labor from 1949 to 1955. In this position, Golda led the construction of numerous homes to integrate the hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants who were arriving in this land after the creation of the state in 1948. At the same time, Golda implemented a social security system, promoted job creation, and sought to balance the interests of workers with the needs of employers. At this moment, Golda changes his last name to the Hebrew one, Golda Meir. After his time at the Ministry of Labor in 1956, he enters a much more complex ministry. Given the emerging situation of the state, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. During her time as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Golda played a crucial role in building the foreign policy of the newly established State of Israel, achieving important progress and also facing several controversies. Her first fundamental step was the establishment of diplomatic relations with several newly independent countries in Africa and Asia. She traveled there to gain recognition of the State of Israel by these nations. This helps to further consolidate Israel's position in this region and on the international stage, as well as to promote cooperation with other states. On the other hand, during the Suez Canal crisis, which arose as a result of the nationalization of the canal by the Egyptian President Nasser in July 1956, he ended up being a key voice in defending Israeli actions before the international community, using his ability to communicate Israel's position and justify the military intervention that Israel carried out. Together with Great Britain and France, the former administrators of that canal, to preserve their hegemony in this area. At the same time, during all these years as foreign minister, Golda had to deal with the tense relations that Israel had with much of the surrounding Arab world. In addition, as foreign minister, Golda significantly strengthened the relations between Israel and the United States, ensuring, on the part of the United States government, a recurring and secure sale of weapons and the granting of millions in funding to the State of Israel, which was vital for its security in a turbulent regional context. For example, it is known that during the Eisenhower administration, the United States gave the Jewish nation about $615 million in funding and weaponry. During John Kennedy's administration, about $200 million was granted to Israel, and during Lyndon Johnson's administration, the high amount of $5 billion was granted in the same categories. All of this was fundamental in the effective consolidation of the nascent State of Israel, which had the support of the United States from the beginning, also sponsored by the Western powers and important economic circles. Israel continues expanding its borders beyond the United Nations' 1947 lines, and it established it in the armistice in 1949, something that in the long run will perpetuate violent clashes between Jews and Palestinians. Going back to the time of accumulated foreign goals of Israel during his 10 years as foreign minister, the truth is that this Iron Lady, always calm and gentle, with the appearance of a pleasant elderly woman, will know how to defend with arguments before the international community the acts of war and other actions by the State of Israel that have caused international controversy. Golda's outstanding handling of international politics and emergency situations made her ideal, so that in 1969, after the sudden death of the then Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol became the favorite candidate of the Israelis at the polls in that year's elections. She was promoted to the top executive position on March 17, 1969. During her term as Prime Minister, Golda, who governed in coalition with the opposition and the majority in parliament, faced various crises that led to her actions being applauded by some, but criticized by many. Although in the international arena, Israel continued to approach several nations around the world, and especially for strategic reasons with the United States, Golda faced serious challenges in both the economic and social spheres. During her term, Israel saw high inflation and a higher cost of living. This led to great social discontent and several protests, which were compounded by social tensions due to the existing inequalities in the country. However, perhaps the most significant event of her term was the Yom Kippur War, which began on October 6, 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel in the south and north of the nation. Although the Israeli intelligence service had received warnings about a possible attack, these were not taken seriously and, as a result, led Golda Meir's government to serious discredit. The Yom Kippur War ended after 3 weeks, causing thousands of deaths on both sides and no clear resolution. Amid various criticisms and many unresolved issues, Golda decides to resign from her position on March 10, 1974 at the age of 76, although this did not mean her disappearance from public life, as she continued to hold important meetings, such as with the United States Secretary, Henry Kissinger, as a mediator between the government of Israel and the Egyptian government to lay the foundations for the Camp David Accords, in which Egypt and Israel signed peace in 1978, marking the first recognition by the Arab world of Israel as a legitimate state. Golda published her autobiography in 1976 and attended international forums and conferences where she was praised for her leadership, although there were always voices, both inside and outside her homeland, that criticized her actions. She also attended Jewish religious and cultural festivities both inside and outside Israel, and she also saw how her health was fading. The lymphoma, detected in 1963 but not treated in time, weakened Golda's body, and at an advanced age on December 8, 1978, after 80 years of life, she passed away after spending several hours in a coma. After her death, she was buried in Jerusalem's pantheon of the greats of the nation, and several posthumous honors were bestowed upon her, as well as harsh criticism of her work during her life. The beautiful lady and her fervent defense of the Zionist cause and the actions behind it, Golda Meir. She ended up being recognized around the world as a symbol of female leadership, although among Jews and in Israel. Mostly, she is remembered as the matriarch of the country for having been one of the most active collaborators in the creation of the State of Israel and the great diplomatic apparatus with which the Jewish nation has managed to consolidate itself and expand its influence to this day, being a key, though often forgotten, figure in the contemporary history of the Middle East. Thank you all very much from the bottom of my heart for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I remind you that your support gives us a big boost and is a great help. By engaging with the channel, commenting, liking, and sharing videos on social media, WhatsApp, or elsewhere, and by activating the bell so you get notifications every time we publish new content. So thank you all again, and may God bless you.